Hi, everyone. One thing that I don't have to explain to you guys at all anymore is net zero by 2050. And it's remarkable that I don't have to do that because just 3 years ago, I would have had to do that. Now everybody knows what net zero is. And that shows up in company climate plans. There was a report this week from a shareholder group that found that they were targeting 166 large companies to set up a climate plan. They found they got 69% of them to commit to net zero by 2050, but only 17% of them set a short-term target to 2030. And so we are in this world where climate action has become something that everybody wants to be a part of, but still don't quite know how to come up with a plan that is credible, that will actually do what scientists say we need to do to be able to tackle this problem. And we have a great panel here of people who influence and shape and create those climate plans, either as companies running them or as people from the outside making sure that companies run them well. And so I'm going to just ask a starting question and then we'll have a conversation. And maybe we'll start with you, Nat, because you run an organization that's pretty remarkable in what it's been able to achieve, where you have 1.5 million employees from all sorts of places who come together and sometimes work on shaping their own company's climate plan. Is there an example that sort of explains how it all works?
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick potted background to Organise. So I run a network of over 1 million workers here in the UK, and we give workers the tools, the network and the confidence to improve their lives at work. So if you think of something like Facebook or LinkedIn, that's a network that's built on top of a social graph, so that's who you know socially. Something like Nextdoor.com is built on a local graph, so people who live near you but you might not know them. We have a network on top of a worker graph, so we map people by their employment status, their industry and their workplace. So they're able to talk to colleagues they might never have met, team up and then raise issues and get them addressed at the top level, so mainly we're targeting company boards. So the example I wanted to talk you through was we have a bunch, like tons of Amazon workers here in the UK. And an Amazon worker in one warehouse up in the north of England was seeing a huge pile of perfectly good TVs, washing machines, chocolate, champagne, all sorts being sent to landfill or the incinerator. And they were walking past this every day. Some of them were having to load the lorries that were sending these goods off. They were things that had been returned. And it was basically cheaper, as we understand it, to get rid of them than it was to do anything else with them. And the worker thought this was outrageous, was super angry about it, but was like, is it just me? Maybe it's just my warehouse? I have no idea. So he ran a survey on Organise to ask the other Amazon workers in our network, is this something you see? And very quickly, in the space of about 48 hours, they had more than 200 examples of warehouses across the country that were doing the same. So they started a petition and they gathered more than 40,000 signatures to raise it up the chain at Amazon. And Amazon's first response was, oh, you've misunderstood, it's not really a problem. And I think this is something we see a lot, is companies' first reaction being like, oh, you don't have the context we have. But the reality is these workers who are living it and they're seeing it, they often have a lot more context than you might have at board level. And that's where it gets really exciting. So they started to take, they took some cameras in, so they took their phones in and filmed, which they're not allowed to do at Amazon very often. So they filmed the types of goods that were being loaded into the lorries, and then they spent a month tracking the volume of goods that were being sent to landfill or the incinerator. And we worked with ITV to do the investigation, and they found that 300,000 items every week were being destroyed. So all of a sudden, the workers have gathered this huge bank of data that they took to Amazon, and then it's very hard to dispute at that point. You've got a new data bank to be like, hang on a minute, the reality of this is very different. And what I love about that, and so Amazon changed their policy, not just in the UK, but also in France and Spain. And what I love about that is the first response from the company, the workers wouldn't accept. They're the ones who are living and seeing the context of the reality of these plans, and they knew it wasn't good enough. Right. And so they carried on. And that's what I love about kind of giving the power and the voice to the workers themselves, because they see the reality of it. Sorry, that was a long rant.
Yeah. And then if you take a step outside the company, there are other people who deeply, deeply care that the company gets their climate plans right. And investors are a part of that. So Mark, you work with investors in trying to get companies to do right by climate. And what's that like? I mean, is there an example that sort of shows how exactly you can use that pressure to make things happen?
Yeah, investors are the rightful owners of many companies. And they do this on behalf of people with a savings account or a pension account. And they one by one realize that climate change is such a big threat, not only to make sure we have a livable world in 20 years from now, But they also realize, the investors, that they can't make any money in a world that doesn't reach the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, in a world that doesn't limit climate change. If climate change gets out of hand, the world will be unlivable, big parts of the world will be unlivable, but also it will be very difficult to make money and to keep the pensions and savings they are trusted with at the same level or even grow them. So they fully realize we have to stop climate change. That's in our interest as a human being, but also in a financial interest, so this goes hand in hand. And then they realize, okay, the biggest contributors to climate change are the fossil fuel companies. So we need to support them, compel them, and if needed, force them to drastically change their business. Otherwise, there's no chance we're going to ever meet the Paris Climate Accord. And one by one, they realize that the oil companies are not going to do it on their own accord, and that they have to steer them in the right direction.
And so is there an example of all the work that you've done where change has happened, and what does change look like?
Yeah, we started with Shell. I'm from the Netherlands, so I founded Organise in 2015 based on the conviction that we need big oil. We need big oil with their brains, their billions, their global reach to speed up the energy transition. Otherwise, there's no chance we're going to ever meet it. So I thought I'd start somewhere with Shell. In the beginning, they didn't want to hear about changing, and the big debating point in the beginning was Scope 3. Scope 3 is the emissions of your customers. What happens when your customers use your products? With the oil industry, that's quite simple. They burn it. But the response of Shell and other oil companies has always been from the beginning, when we started asking them, you have to set targets to decrease your emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, which means approximately halving them in 2030. Not only your own emissions, but especially the emissions of your customers. And they said, no, our customers, that's not our responsibility. And because investors started voting for a shareholder resolution, which we put on the agenda of the annual shareholders meeting, because investors, big institutional investors, started voting for that, Shell set a target for Scope 3. They initially promised to halve their emissions by 2050. Now they even say net zero by 2050. So they really did something that they really didn't want to do, and that's setting a target for Scope 3. That's really crossing the Rubicon. And BP, Equinor, where we also filed a resolution, the exact same pattern happened. Scope 3 is not our problem. Shareholders vote against this resolution. Shareholders voted for the resolution, and they set a Scope 3 target. In the US with Chevron, exactly the same happened. So now we've basically proven that this approach works, that you can basically get these boards to do something they don't want to do. And now the next step is, of course, that they not only make promises for 2050, because that's quite easy. I'm in my 80s, these guys are in their 90s then. That's an easy promise. They have to take action now and make a good plan for the next 10 years. Yeah. So that's the next step. And investors are more and more realizing that this needs to be done.
Right. And then, Sandrine, you hear from lots of different, I mean, as a chief sustainability officer, you have pressure sometimes from employees, sometimes from investors, sometimes from your own board. You'd have maybe the chief executive has some interest, the financial officer has some interest. You have to combine all that, take the science in consideration, and then come up with a plan. You know, how do you tackle those different influences to come up with a plan?
Yeah. For sure, we have different influences. Just maybe from an investor's point of view, you know, we are wine and spirit activity from LVMH, and investors are closest to LVMH and more far from MH. But otherwise, we have a lot of stakeholders. Just to come back of what you say, Scope 1, 2, and 3, that's very important for us. And it's a global carbon footprint. And this is the reason why we have decided, of course, to be registered, to be validated by SBT initiatives for Scope 1, 2, and 3, and to follow the 1.5 trajectory. So, you know, we are really interested on this.
So you're part of the subject. 17% of the companies that have done it.
Yeah, yes, we are in the small part maybe of the company. I think more and more companies have some close target, you know, 2030 target.
Yes.
And we have decided to reduce by half our carbon emission for.
And for a company like yours, it's a lot more difficult to estimate what exactly happens when your customers use your products. For an oil major, that's quite simple. For you, it's much more difficult. So it's good you give the example to them that it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From customers, and we have a stakeholder which is really important for us, is our suppliers. You know, because for example, if we are looking for the main emission are coming from packaging for our activity, you know, and packaging, we are selling a lot of glass bottle, and glass is a fantastic material because it is recyclable, and we don't find them normally in incinerator at the end of life. But glass is very emitting when you produce glass. So in fact, we have to work with our glass producer, with our glass makers, to be sure they reduce their own carbon footprint, because they are in the scope 3, in fact. And it's a huge part of our scope 3.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other side, which is we were talking about how different actors come and affect a company's climate plan. But once you, as a big company, sets a climate plan, you also then compel your suppliers whose emissions are on your books to also make changes so they can reduce emissions. I mean, is that something that you've found with oil companies? Of course, their scope 3 is largely customer based, but you know, we've had methane emissions targets being set. Are there like suppliers that have been compelled because of the work that you have done to get oil companies to set climate targets?
Yeah, I think the oil majors take their suppliers in their slipstream because they all love to set scope 1 and 2 targets,
right,
because that's only 10%, 15% of their total impact. So that's what they're doing. And of course, their suppliers have to follow them. They're huge companies. They have quite a strong buying power. So I think most suppliers just have to do what they're told and decreasing their emissions. So that's a big part of getting the suppliers moving. But the elephant in the room stays the scope 3 part of the burning of fossil fuels.
Now, one thing that happens with climate plans, and I write about them very often, is that there's a lot of jargon. You know, already we've explained some of that jargon as we've talked about it, but does that filter down to the people who also need to care about these things? Nat, maybe this is an example that you could try and give us how, like, workers who are doing things that may have nothing to do with climate, they probably read news stories about how climate change is going to affect the world and maybe them. You know, how does that filter up to them actually doing something about it?
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things we see, if you asked workers, like if you were down the pub with a friend and you said, you know, how do we make this pub more sustainable? They'd probably really struggle to answer the question. But if you ask them, how do we make this pub better? They might be like, oh, actually, that corner's really cold. And then, you know, actually, we want to increase the insulation and reduce the heat in the pub, right? So the same principle applies when you're talking with workers. So we have a weekly survey that goes out to 10% of our membership each week, just asking, what do you like from work that would make it better? And that's where a lot of the climate and sustainability ideas come from. But it's not from a lens of sustainability. It's just from a lens of improving my life at work, my day at work, what I'm doing. So we had an example of Network Rail have changed how they allocate vans to their engineers who are going out, which on paper looks great because they're doing less miles as vans, but the staff, because the van hubs are in places without public transport, the staff are still having to drive there and back. So they're actually driving significantly more miles, and in terms of their emissions, they're dramatically increased. Even though on paper it looks like the actual miles Network Rail vans are doing is reduced, the actual miles being done nationwide are increasing. And then in terms of the workers themselves, to make it better, they would rather just have their vans back and be able to drive directly to jobs again. But they probably wouldn't think of that as a sustainability solution. That's just a practical solution. Right. And I think there's an interesting synergy between the things that are quite practical are often quite sustainable.
Right.
So making sure we're not talking in terms that exclude the people who probably have the best ideas.
Right. And the same question for you, Sandrine. Like, when you talk to suppliers that you have to, look, we've set a climate plan, now you have to, because without you, we won't be able to succeed. What are the kinds of things that you have to explain to them to get them to actually change their ways as well?
In fact, it depends the size, of the supplier. It's not the same if you are talking about this subject with a big player, as I said, rather than a small one. So we don't say you have to. First of all, we say we are in the same boat, and the thing is we have to onboard everybody. So the first thing is to place this subject as a strategic one. So now we have not just supplier business review, but supplier business and sustainability review. So that's very important, you know, to always place the subject at the heart of the strategy. So first of all, it's something which is existing everywhere right now, and we, for sure, even if we don't say you have to, we push them, you know, and we explain our trajectory. We explain our commitment to decrease by half. So for sure, they understand that because they are quite half of our part of our carbon footprint, they have to do quite the same. And again, I think it's very important to understand it's a collective work. So for example, if we want to decrease the emission for a glass bottle, first of all, we have to work on it. We have to decrease the weight, maybe the shape of the bottle, and otherwise they have to work on their energetic mix, of course, to produce this bottle. So right. It's really a collective work, I think, and this is the only way in order to go further.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite interesting that you will have to work at the design level. So you're not just working with them saying, you know, you need to do this, but because the changes they make will affect your product and the look of your product, that would make a difference, right? And then one other thing, and we are coming close to the end, so I want to make sure that if you have any questions, you submit them through the app, and Meg will ask them at the end, so in 3 or 4 minutes. But one thing I wanted to understand, just because when we talk about the influence towards climate plan, are there factors that are not commonly thought of that also come into play? And this could be an example, whether you're creating a climate plan or whether you're trying to create a shareholder resolution. Is there, you know, complexities that you have to eke out and make sure that people understand? Maybe Mark, you can take that.
Yeah, what we've learned along the way is that investors, shareholders, don't want to be prescriptive. They don't want to be in the driver's seat. That's the responsibility of the board. So they basically, what we say basically in our shareholder resolution is, you have to decrease your emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. This means approximately halving by 2030 and being at 0 in 2050. How you're going to do that is completely up to you. You are the board. You have to take this bold and brave decisions to get there. So that's quite, for shareholders, institutional investors, it's quite important. Okay, these are your goals, company-wide, but it's up to you how to achieve them.
Right. Now, one pressure point we didn't talk about is consumers, because in some cases, consumers understand, you know, if they're using fossil fuels, they know that there is a link directly to emissions. But in most cases, they don't know whether things are connected to emissions. So in your case, your products directly interact with consumers. Do you feel if there is pressure that your product needs to be greener, or do you need to educate your customer that we are a greener company because we do these things? Like, how does that work?
Honestly, we don't receive a lot of pressure for the moment, but it will come for sure in our activity. But we really want to play our part, even if we don't receive this pressure. And it's very important to explain everything again, to explain to our employees and to explain to our consumer. So, for example, if we take the champagne Ruinart, you know, we have changed the packaging, the gift box. Before it was a gift box in cardboard, like a square one, and we change in what we call the second skin, so something really fit to the product with a recycled cardboard, and we explain to the consumer why this packaging is better for the planet, because it is 100% recyclable, it's less cardboard, and less packaging at the end. So we explain that, and we receive a lot of good, of course, a good feedback from consumer that we explain everything. And just to come back, because we clearly focus on climate, but I think we have not to forget, and very often, to connect climate and biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity. And very often, we call them twin challenges. It's not. And for Moët Hennessy, for example, we have a clear issue concerning the soils. You know, we are coming from soils. Our products are coming from vineyard, and we have to really focus on this subject. Yeah. And again, you know, just to link with the consumers, we have to explain to the consumers all what we are doing. So the new practices we want to implement in our vineyards. And we have to involve as well our suppliers.
Yes.
You know, our wine growers, our wine makers. We really want to help them to transform their practices.
So I'm going to go to Meg next, but just one more question for you, Nat, before that. I mean, we talked a lot about climate because, you know, it's a topic that everybody understands very easily. But we also talk about ESG. So there's other aspects to making a company a better company. And there are things that Organise has done beyond the climate part, which have also had an impact. Is there an example that?
I think like our biggest thing, and this will be no surprise to anyone in the room, at the moment it's around cost of living and pay. So like our biggest issue by far at the moment is pay, and that's often for us when they win a living wage or they win a pay rise, that's a gateway issue for them then to start to think about what else can I fix in my workplace. But for us, so very recently we had a big campaign at John Lewis. So John Lewis obviously being an interesting one because it's owned by its employees as well. And they ran a campaign for about 10 months to become a living wage employer and get a living wage, not just across the country, but also in London, which was the big barrier for them. Right. We see lots of cool stuff.
Any questions I should be taking?
Yeah, I have one for Sandrine. And you kind of answered this a little bit with the packaging, but is there a circularity process in place, or do you have one planned for the future?
In terms of packaging, you mean?
Circularity. Do you have a
circularity
plan? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Again, if we are speaking about glass, you know, the glass is recyclable, and we really want to be sure that in every country, glass is recyclable. And for the moment, we have to push this circularity. That's the first thing. And the second thing, we want to add some recycled glass in our bottle. And again, we have to organize this circularity for that. So this is for glass, quite the same for our gift box. Yes, it's for sure. When we speak about eco-design, you know, we clearly focus on circularity to create our new packaging.
If I can make a remark about that. This is a really good example of a supplier offering new products to customers, saying, okay, this is a better product, please buy it. There are too many suppliers, especially in the oil and gas industry, who have said for decades, yeah, we want to offer renewable products, but our customers are not asking for it. And I think these companies have a responsibility to take leadership and just offer it. And of course people will buy it then. But it should not be the other way around, otherwise it goes too slow. Yeah.
If there isn't can I ask the last question? You know, one thing I like to be able to write about is solutions, and we talked a lot about solutions. But of course, the reason we talk about solutions is because problems are typically bigger. So maybe, Mark, last question for you before we end. We talked about net zero. We talked about the shareholder resolutions that finally got them to agree to these Scope 3 targets. But oil companies are still far away from where they are. In that study from Climate Action 100 Plus, where 69% of the companies set a net zero target, oil companies were in there, but were they in the short-term target goal, for example?
This report makes very clear that there's no single oil major with a good plan to decrease emissions this decade. They all have these great promises for 2050, long beyond their tenure. The people who have to do that are just hired in these companies. They become the CEO in 25 years from now. So it's a lot of talk about 2050, but no concrete plans to decrease emissions in this decade. They all want to grow. And this report, and it's very important, it's a report by a huge investors alliance, makes this crystal clear that despite they tick the boxes on 2050, no one ticks the box on 2030.
Yeah.
And the fight against climate change will be won or lost in the next 10 years. And the decisions to win that fight have to be made today, tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow, but at least in the next couple of years, because otherwise no chance to reach the Paris Climate Agreement. If we continue to grow emissions, then net zero by 2050 is an empty promise.
Yeah. No, it's quite a change that we now all can understand net zero by 2050. Hopefully by the time we have such a conversation again in 3 or 4 years, there'll be even more awareness of all the problems, but also all the solutions that are available. So thank you, everybody, for your insights.